I'm 89 years old now, and there is one mistake I carried for most of my life. I believed that if someone stayed in my life long enough, they must belong there. That sounds simple when I say it now, almost too simple. But some truths only become simple after they have cost you half a lifetime. I used to think time proved love. I thought years meant something by themselves. If a person had been at your table for 20 years, I believed they had earned a place there. If they knew your children when they were small, if they remembered your husband's name, if they had stood beside you at church suppers and Christmas programs and hospital bake sales, then surely that meant they were part of your life in a real way. I do not believe that anymore. I wish I had learned it sooner. There are people who can stand beside you for years and never really be with you. There are people who know every detail of your calendar and almost nothing about your heart. There are people who will call you dependable, generous, faithful, and kind, but what they really mean is useful. And usefulness can look a lot like love when you are young enough, or lonely enough, or loyal enough to mistake one for the other. My name is Evelyn Harper. I was an elementary school librarian for 38 years. I spent most of my life in the small town, where everybody knew which pew your family sat in and what kind of pie you brought to the church basement. I raised 2 children there. I buried my husband there. I watched other people's children grow tall enough to bring their own children into the library. I knew which boys would pretend they hated reading and then hide adventure books inside their jackets. I knew which little girls liked horse stories. I knew which children came to school hungry, though nobody said it out loud. A librarian sees more than people think. You learn how to notice quiet things. A child holding a book too tightly. A mother smiling when she is tired enough to cry. A man clearing his throat because he does not know how to ask for help. I noticed those things in other people, but for a long time I did not notice them in my own life. That is the funny and painful thing about age. You look back and wonder how you could have understood so much about everyone else and so little about yourself. I was always the steady one. That is what people called me. Steady Evelyn. If there was a funeral meal to organize, they called me. If the school needed volunteers, they called me. If the church roof leaked and someone had to collect checks, they called me. If a neighbor broke her hip and needed casseroles arranged, they called me. I took pride in that. I will not pretend I did not. There is a warm feeling that comes from being needed. It makes you feel rooted. It makes you feel like your life has a shape. Back then, I thought being needed was the same as being loved. I was wrong. The first time life tried to teach me that, I was in my 40s. I did not understand the lesson then. I only felt the ache of it. There was a woman named Margaret Whitcomb. She was not a bad woman. I want to say that clearly. People do not have to be terrible to hurt you. Sometimes they only have to be limited. Margaret and I met through the town reading fair. The school wanted to raise money for new books, and someone decided we should hold a weekend event in the community hall. Used books, homemade cookies, children reading poems on a little wooden stage. It was the kind of thing small towns used to do before everybody got too busy to look each other in the eye. Margaret was assigned to the refreshment table. I was handling the books. By the end of that first Saturday, we were both exhausted, laughing over spilled coffee and a box of donated encyclopedias nobody wanted. She had a quick laugh, sharp but friendly. She wore her hair pinned back with little pearl clips and always had a pencil tucked behind her ear. At the end of the weekend, we had raised enough money for 3 shelves of new children's books. Margaret hugged me in the parking lot and said, "We make a good team." I believed her. For the next 19 years, Margaret and I were a team. That is what everyone called us. If there was a charity drive, it was Evelyn and Margaret. If the church needed the Christmas basket list organized, Evelyn and Margaret. If the school held a spring carnival, Evelyn and Margaret. If the hospital auxiliary needed someone to count raffle tickets, Evelyn and Margaret. We spent hours together in church basements that smelled like coffee and floor wax. We folded tablecloths. We made phone calls. We taped signs to walls. We counted coins in coffee cans. We drove to the print shop together and argued gently about whether the flyers should be blue or yellow. She knew how I took my coffee. I knew she hated raisins in anything. She knew my son's birthday. I knew when her sister had surgery. When my husband Thomas would ask if I was going to be late again, I would say, "Margaret needs help." And he would smile a little and say, "Margaret always needs help." I did not hear the meaning in that, not then. Thomas saw more than I gave him credit for. Good husbands often do. He never told me not to help. That was not his way. He would just stand in the doorway while I packed another tray of lemon bars and say, "Does she ever come by when there isn't work to do?" I would wave him off. "That's how friendships are when you're busy," I would say. I had an answer for everything back then. Most people do when they are avoiding the truth. The warning signs were small, so small I could step over them without noticing. Margaret called when the fall fundraiser needed planning. She called when the church directory had to be updated. She called when her cousin's granddaughter needed a reference for a library job. She called when she needed someone to pick up napkins from the supply store because she was running behind. But she did not call just to ask how I was. Not once that I can remember. If I invited her for tea on an ordinary afternoon, she usually had something else. A dentist appointment, a roast in the oven, a nephew stopping by. But if there were envelopes to stuff or pies to label, she would sit beside me for 5 hours. I thought that meant we were close. I thought closeness was built by doing things together, and it can be, but not always. Sometimes shared work only hides the absence of shared care. I remember one winter especially. It was the year Thomas had his first heart trouble. Nothing fatal then, just enough to frighten us. He had tightness in his chest one Sunday morning before church. The doctor said he needed tests. I remember sitting in the waiting room with my gloves still on, because my hands were too cold to take them off. I was scared, not loud scared, quiet scared, the kind that sits under your ribs. That week, Margaret and I were supposed to organize the senior luncheon. I called her and said I might not be able to come. Thomas had appointments. I was worried. There was a pause. Then she said, of course, family first." She said the right words. Then she asked if I had already ordered the rolls. I remember that. Isn't it strange what the heart keeps? Not the whole conversation, just that one small turn. Family first, then the rolls. I told myself she was nervous. I told myself she did not know what to say. I told myself people show care differently. That is another thing I wish I had learned sooner. When you keep making excuses for how someone loves you, you may already know they do not love you well. Thomas recovered from that scare. Life went on. The luncheon happened. The rolls arrived. Margaret thanked me in front of everyone and said she could not have done it without me. People clapped. I smiled. And because everyone saw us standing together, I kept believing the friendship was real. Years passed that way. A friendship made of tasks, of sign-up sheets, of phone trees, of borrowed serving spoons, of long afternoons spent preparing things for other people. There were moments I truly enjoyed. I will not take that away from the memory. Margaret could be funny. She could make a whole room move faster just by walking into it. She had a way of getting people to say yes before they knew they had agreed. I admired that. I also confused it with warmth. When I turned 65, the school held a retirement party for me. Children I had once helped were grown by then. Some came back with babies on their hips. The principal gave a speech. My daughter cried. Thomas held my hand under the table. Margaret was there too. She helped arrange the cake. She made sure the punch bowl stayed full. She collected the cards in a basket. Everyone said, "Of course Margaret is helping. Those two are inseparable." That word stayed with me. Inseparable. I liked hearing it. It made me feel chosen. It made me feel like my life had proof of friendship in it. But after I retired, things changed. Not all at once. That would have been easier to see. It happened quietly, the way dust gathers on a shelf. First, there were fewer calls. Then no calls unless there was a committee meeting. Then the committees changed. Younger women came in. They used email instead of phone trees. They ordered desserts instead of baking them. They did not need me the way people used to. And when they stopped needing me, Margaret seemed to stop needing me too. I invited her to lunch one Tuesday. She said she was busy. I invited her again a month later. She said spring was hectic. I called her after Thanksgiving just to ask how she was. She answered, but there was a rushed sound in her voice, like I had caught her between more important things. We spoke for 7 minutes. I know because I stared at the kitchen clock the whole time. When I hung up, I stood there with the phone in my hand. The house was quiet. Thomas was in the garage sorting old tools. A pot of soup was cooling on the stove. Nothing terrible had happened. No one had insulted me. No one had betrayed me in a way you could point to. But I felt something settle inside me. A small, heavy disappointment. The kind you cannot explain without sounding foolish. I had spent nearly 20 years beside this woman. 20 years. And without the work there was almost nothing there. I sat down at the kitchen table and tried to remember the last time Margaret had asked me a question. that had nothing to do with the task. I could not think of one, not one. That was the first time I understood just a little that I had mistaken being useful for being loved. I did not have the words for it yet. I only knew that a relationship I thought was sturdy had vanished the moment I stopped holding it up. And that kind of loneliness is hard to describe, because you are not mourning a fight, you are not mourning a death. You are mourning the discovery that something you treasured may never have been what you thought it was. I remember sitting there while the afternoon light came through the curtains, feeling foolish at my age, too old to be surprised, too old to be hurt by an unanswered invitation, too old to admit that I had wanted someone to choose me when there was nothing to be done. But I did want that. I wanted Margaret to call when there were no flyers to fold. I wanted her to sit at my table when nobody needed a casserole. I wanted to know that after all those years, I mattered beyond what I could provide. And on that quiet afternoon with the soup cooling and the phone silent, I began to suspect that maybe I had not mattered that way at all. For a while I told myself I was being too sensitive. That is a dangerous sentence, especially for women of my generation. We were taught to be polite, to be understanding, to give people the benefit of the doubt, to smooth rough edges instead of examining them. And sometimes those habits become blindfolds. A few years after I retired, I joined a discussion group at church. Nothing formal, just a small gathering on Wednesday mornings. Coffee, cookies, a circle of folding chairs, people talking about life, faith, family, and growing older. Most of us had known each other for years, some for decades. That is where I became close to a woman named Carol. At least, I thought I became close to her. Carol had a calm voice, the kind people immediately trust. She never interrupted, never raised her voice, never said anything obviously unkind. If you met her once, you would probably describe her as thoughtful. I certainly did, at first. When I mentioned taking an art class after retirement, Carol smiled. Then she asked if I thought I would get bored with it after a few weeks. When I talked about visiting my daughter in Colorado, Carol wondered aloud whether traveling at my age might become exhausting. When I mentioned volunteering at the library again, Carol asked whether I was sure I wasn't taking on too much. None of those comments sounded cruel. That was the problem. Every remark arrived wrapped in concern. Every doubt came disguised as care. I rarely left our conversations feeling attacked. I simply left feeling smaller, less certain, less confident. At first I assumed the problem was me. Maybe I was becoming fragile. Maybe age was making me overly emotional. Maybe I was reading things that weren't there. That is what I told myself, but the feeling stayed. One morning I spent nearly 20 minutes deciding what to wear before one of our meetings. That may not sound unusual, but it was unusual for me. I had spent most of my life dressing for comfort, not approval. As I stood there holding 2 sweaters, I suddenly heard Carol's voice in my head. Not because she had said anything recently, because I had started carrying her opinions with me. That realization bothered me more than I wanted to admit. When you reach your late 70s, you expect to know yourself. You expect to have earned a certain freedom from other people's judgments. Yet there I was, worrying about what another woman might think of my choices. The strange thing was that Carol never demanded that power. I handed it to her myself, slowly, conversation by conversation, comment by comment, doubt by doubt. I remember one particular Wednesday. The group had been discussing hobbies. Someone asked about my watercolor paintings. I had started painting after Thomas died, mostly flowers, birds, trees, nothing remarkable, just things that made the house feel less empty. When I mentioned an upcoming local exhibit, Carol smiled and said, "That sounds brave." Brave, not good, not exciting, not wonderful, brave. Then she added that art shows could be difficult because people sometimes received criticism they weren't prepared for. The room moved on. Nobody noticed anything unusual, but I carried those words home. That evening I stared at a painting sitting on my kitchen table, a simple watercolor of an old oak tree. For the first time in months I wondered if I should stop painting altogether. That frightened me, not because of Carol, because I realized how easily another person's uncertainty had become my own. The next morning I walked into the kitchen and looked at that same painting, and for a brief moment I became angry, not at her, at myself. I was nearly 80 years old. I had raised children, buried parents, said goodbye to my husband, worked for decades, survived grief, survived disappointment, and somehow I was allowing another person's quiet opinions to occupy space inside my mind. That was when I began paying attention, not to what Carol said, to how I felt afterward. The pattern became impossible to ignore. I always felt relieved when our conversations ended, not comforted, not encouraged, relieved. There is a difference, a very important one. Still, I stayed, longer than I should have, because by then we had known each other for years. History has a way of disguising reality. The longer a relationship lasts, the harder it becomes to question it. You start believing the years themselves mean something, as if time automatically proves value, as if duration automatically proves care. I believed that for a very long time. Then life gave me one more lesson, and this one hurt more than the others. By then I was in my 80s. Thomas had been gone for several years. The sharpest edges of grief had softened, not disappeared, just softened. I had begun building a different kind of life, smaller, quieter, more intentional. I joined a senior travel group. I painted more often. I spent afternoons reading on my porch. I even made a few new friends. One of them was a woman named Diane. I had known Diane casually for years, the kind of acquaintance who sends Christmas cards and remembers birthdays. After Thomas died, we spoke more often. She called every week, sometimes twice. She always sounded interested, always asked questions, always listened. or so I thought. One afternoon, my great-granddaughter Emma received a full academic scholarship. I was sitting in my kitchen when my daughter called with the news. I cried, right there at the table. Not because of the scholarship itself, because I remembered Emma as a little girl who used to sit on the floor of my library reading books upside down. I remembered scraped knees, missing front teeth, school concerts. Suddenly she was preparing for university. I felt proud in a way only age can understand. When you live long enough, other people's achievements become part of your own memories. That evening I called Diane. I wanted to share the joy. I wanted someone else to celebrate with me. When she answered, I could barely contain my excitement. I told her everything, the scholarship, the letter, Emma's reaction, the family's happiness. There was a short pause. Then Diane said, "That's wonderful. I just hope she doesn't get overwhelmed. Those programs can be extremely demanding." That was all. One sentence, one small sentence. Nothing cruel, nothing shocking, nothing anyone else would notice. But something inside me sank, because I realized she had skipped right over the joy. She had gone straight to the worry, straight to the shadow, straight to the problem. After we hung up, I sat alone at the kitchen table, and instead of celebrating Emma's achievement, I found myself worrying. Would she struggle? Would she become overwhelmed? Would it be too much pressure? For 2 days those thoughts stayed with me. 2 days. Then I caught myself, and I asked a question I should have asked years earlier. Why did this keep happening? Why did certain people always seem to leave me carrying doubt instead of peace? That question would not leave me alone. The more I thought about it, the more memories surfaced. Other conversations, other celebrations, other moments that somehow felt smaller afterward. A successful trip, a painting I was proud of, a happy family gathering, a new friendship. Again and again, the same pattern appeared. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, just small reductions, small shadows, small ways of making bright moments feel dimmer. And for the first time, I began wondering whether the greatest loss was not these relationships themselves. Maybe the greatest loss was how many years I had spent protecting them. For a long time, I treated what happened with Margaret as a disappointment, nothing more. People grow apart. Life changes. Retirement rearranges relationships. That was the explanation I gave myself, and maybe there was some truth in it. But age has a way of revisiting old lessons when you have not fully learned them. A few years later, I joined a Wednesday morning discussion group at church. Nothing formal, just coffee, folding chairs, and conversation. Most of us were retired. Some were widowed. Some were caring for aging spouses. The topics changed every week: family, faith, health, memories. The strange things that happen when you realize there are more years behind you than ahead of you. That is where I became close to a woman named Carol. At least, I believed I became close to her. Carol had a gift that many people mistake for kindness. She listened carefully. She spoke softly. She never interrupted. She never argued. When she entered a room, people relaxed. When she offered an opinion, people took it seriously. I certainly did. The first few months felt pleasant, comfortable. I enjoyed talking with her. Then small things started happening, the kind of things that seem insignificant when viewed alone. I mentioned taking watercolor classes. Carol smiled. Then she asked whether I thought I would lose interest after a few weeks. I mentioned visiting my daughter in Colorado. Carol wondered whether travel might become too difficult at my age. I talked about volunteering at the library again. Carol worried that I might be overextending myself. Nothing she said sounded harsh. Nothing sounded cruel. If I repeated her comments to another person, they would probably agree she sounded thoughtful. That is what made it difficult to understand. I never left those conversations feeling attacked. I simply left feeling uncertain. And uncertainty can be surprisingly exhausting, especially when it arrives disguised as concern. At first I blamed myself. Maybe I was becoming too sensitive. Maybe retirement had made me emotional. Maybe widowhood had made me vulnerable. I kept searching for explanations that protected the friendship. I never considered questioning the friendship itself. One morning I was standing in front of my closet preparing for our meeting. I picked up a blue sweater. Then I put it down. Picked up a grey one. Put it down too. I stood there longer than I should have, long enough to realize something uncomfortable. I was imagining Carol's reaction. Not because she had ever criticized my clothes, because I had slowly started carrying her opinions into rooms she was not even in. That realization stayed with me. The older you get, the more surprising certain discoveries become. You expect to worry less about what people think, not more. You expect confidence to increase with age, not disappear. Yet there I was, a woman approaching 80, still giving another person's voice space inside my own head. The pattern became impossible to ignore after that. Every conversation left me slightly diminished, not devastated, not wounded, just smaller. And the accumulation of small things can become very heavy. One afternoon I told the group about a local art exhibit. A few of my paintings had been accepted. Nothing extraordinary, just a small community display. I was excited, proud even, not because the paintings were exceptional, because I had started creating again after losing Thomas. The paintings represented something important. They represented life continuing. When I mentioned the exhibit, Carol smiled. Then she said, "That sounds brave." Brave. Not beautiful, not exciting, not wonderful. Brave. Then she gently reminded me that public displays often invited criticism. The room moved on. The conversation continued. But I carried those words home. That evening I sat at my kitchen table, staring at a watercolor painting of an oak tree. And for the first time, I wondered if I should stop painting. The thought shocked me, not because of Carol, because I realized how much influence I had given her. I had spent decades teaching children to trust their curiosity, yet I was allowing another person's doubts to become my own. That night I barely slept. I kept replaying conversations, comments, questions, little moments I had dismissed, and for the first time I asked myself a question that made me uncomfortable. Why did I always feel relieved when our conversations ended? Not comforted, not encouraged, relieved. There is a difference, a very important difference. Still, I stayed, because by then we had known each other for years. History can become a trap when you are not paying attention. The longer a relationship lasts, the harder it becomes to evaluate honestly. You start assuming the years themselves prove something, as if time automatically creates value, as if familiarity automatically creates closeness. I believed that, long after I should have stopped believing it. Then life brought me one final lesson, and this one hurt more than the others. By then I was in my 80s. Thomas had been gone for several years. The sharpest edges of grief had softened. The loneliness still visited, but it no longer lived in every room. I had slowly rebuilt pieces of my life. I joined a senior travel group. I painted more often. I read books simply because I enjoyed them. I learned how to spend an afternoon without feeling guilty for it. Around that time, I became closer to a woman named Diane. I had known Diane Pasley for years. Christmas cards, church events, birthday calls. Nothing especially deep. After Thomas passed away, our conversations became more frequent. She checked on me often, asked about my health, asked about my children, remembered little details. I appreciated that, more than she probably knew. Loneliness can make attention feel like friendship. That is another lesson people rarely discuss. One afternoon my daughter called with wonderful news. My great-granddaughter Emma had received a full university scholarship. I started crying before my daughter even finished speaking. Not because of the scholarship itself, because I remembered Emma as a little girl sitting cross-legged on the library floor with books spread around her like flower petals. I remembered scraped knees, missing teeth, elementary school concerts, sleepovers. Now she was preparing for university, one life becoming another. That is one of the privileges of growing old. You get to witness entire lifetimes unfold. That evening I called Diane. I could barely wait to tell her. I shared every detail, the scholarship, the excitement, Emma's reaction, the family's pride. There was a brief silence. Then Diane said something very simple. "That's wonderful. I just hope she can handle that kind of pressure." That was all. One sentence. Nothing dramatic, nothing cruel, nothing anyone else would remember. But something inside me sank, because she had stepped around the joy entirely. She went directly to the worry, directly to the shadow, directly to the problem. After we hung up, I sat alone at my kitchen table. Instead of celebrating Emma's achievement, I found myself worrying. Was it too much pressure? Would she struggle? Would she become overwhelmed? For 2 days those thoughts stayed with me. 2 days. Then I suddenly stopped, and a question appeared in my mind. Not about Emma, about Diane. Why did this keep happening? Why did certain people always seem to leave me carrying doubt instead of peace? The question would not leave me alone. The more I thought about it, the more memories surfaced. Other conversations, other celebrations, other accomplishments. Moments that should have felt bright, moments that somehow felt smaller afterward. A successful trip, a finished painting, a happy holiday, a new friendship. Again and again the same pattern appeared. Not criticism, not cruelty, just reduction. A little less joy, a little less confidence, a little less light. And as those memories gathered together, another realization began forming beneath them. Something heavier, something far more painful. Maybe the greatest loss was not these relationships. Maybe the greatest loss was how many years I had spent protecting them. Maybe I had been defending connections that never truly made my life warmer. And for the first time, that possibility frightened me. That possibility stayed with me for weeks. Not every hour, not every day, but often enough. I would be washing dishes and think about it. I would be sitting on the porch, watching the evening light settle over the neighborhood and think about it. I would wake up in the middle of the night and find myself staring at the ceiling, thinking about it. Maybe the greatest loss was not those relationships. Maybe it was the years I spent carrying them, protecting them, explaining them, defending them. At first I tried to push the thought away. Most people do. Because once a certain realization enters your life, it becomes difficult to return to the old story. And I had lived inside the old story for a very long time. The old story said loyalty was always a virtue. The old story said staying was proof of character. The old story said history deserved automatic respect. I had believed those things for decades. Then one rainy afternoon, I found myself cleaning a desk drawer I had ignored for years. It was one of those ordinary tasks that begins for no particular reason. You open a drawer looking for one thing. Then an hour disappears. Old receipts, birthday cards, photographs, paper clips that somehow survived 3 different decades. Near the back of the drawer sat a small address book. The cover was worn. The corners were bent. The pages had yellowed with age. I picked it up and smiled. I had carried that little book almost everywhere for years. Long before cell phones. Long before contact lists lived inside screens. Every name in that book had once mattered, or so I believed. I sat down at the kitchen table and started turning pages. There was Dorothy. We used to spend entire afternoons shopping together. I had not spoken to her in 12 years. There was Frank and Louise. We used to have dinner every month. I could not remember the last time we sat in the same room. There was Helen, there was Roger, there was Martha, name after name, life after life. Some had moved away, some had passed on, some had simply drifted into memory. As I turned the pages, I noticed something strange. I felt sadness for some names, warmth for others. But for many of them I felt almost nothing. Not resentment, not grief, just distance. The relationship had ended long before I admitted it. And suddenly a thought arrived so quietly I almost missed it. I had spent years carrying relationships that no longer existed, not because they were still alive, because I believed they were supposed to be. That realization sat with me for a long time. I remember looking out the kitchen window, the rain tapping softly against the glass, the address book open in front of me, and for the first time the pattern connected itself. Margaret, Carol, Diane, different people, different years, different circumstances, yet somehow the same lesson. Margaret had taught me that being needed is not the same as being valued. Carol had taught me that concern is not always support. Diane had taught me that attention is not the same as emotional generosity. For years I thought those stories were about them. Sitting there at my kitchen table, I realized they were mostly about me, about what I believed, about what I refused to question, about the meaning I attached to time. I had assumed that a relationship became valuable simply because it survived. But relationships are not old houses. Age alone does not make them stronger. Some relationships grow warmer over time. Others simply grow older. And I had confused those two things for most of my life. That realization did not arrive like lightning. There was no dramatic moment, no tears, no speech, no sudden transformation, just a quiet understanding settling into place, the kind that changes your life without making any noise at all. After that day, I did not start ending friendships. That is not what happened. I did not call people and confront them. I did not write letters. I did not announce new boundaries. Life is usually less dramatic than that. What changed was much smaller and much more important. I stopped chasing relationships that left me tired. I stopped filling every silence. I stopped assuming every connection had to be maintained forever. Some people called less often. I stopped worrying about why. Some invitations never arrived. I stopped taking it personally. Some relationships faded naturally. For the first time, I let them. There was an unexpected freedom in that, a lightness. Not because I suddenly had fewer people, because I finally stopped carrying responsibilities that belonged to nobody. I stopped measuring my worth by how many relationships I could keep alive. That had exhausted me for years. The funny thing is that my life did not become smaller afterward. In some ways it became richer. The people who remained became easier to see. A neighbor who occasionally brought soup when she made too much. A friend who listened without turning every conversation into advice. My daughter calling simply to hear my voice. My grandson stopping by with coffee on a Saturday morning. Small things, ordinary things, the kinds of things I once overlooked because I was so busy protecting larger relationships. When you stop chasing the wrong connections, you finally have time to notice the right ones. That surprised me. I had always assumed letting go would create loneliness. Instead, it created space, and space allowed other things to grow. Not immediately, not dramatically, just gradually. The way a garden changes when you finally stop watering plants that died years ago. I sometimes think about how much energy I spent maintaining appearances. How often I told myself a relationship was healthy because it had history. How often I confused familiarity with closeness. I know why I did it. Most people do. We are afraid of loss, afraid of change, afraid of admitting something important is no longer what it used to be. There is grief in that, real grief, even when nobody dies. Sometimes we mourn the idea of a relationship more than the relationship itself. That took me many years to understand. If I could sit beside the younger version of myself, I would not tell her to trust fewer people. That is not the lesson. I would not tell her to become suspicious. That is not the lesson either. I would simply tell her to pay attention to how she feels after spending time with someone, not what they say, not how long she has known them, not what role they play in her life, how she feels. Because our hearts often understand things long before our minds are willing to admit them. Mine certainly did. There were moments with Margaret when I felt unseen, moments with Carol when I felt smaller, moments with Diane when I felt my joy dim. The truth was there all along. I simply kept explaining it away, and perhaps that is why age matters. Not because older people become wiser automatically. Many do not. Age simply gives you enough distance to finally see the patterns, enough years to notice what repeated, enough experience to recognize what was always true. At 89, I no longer believe loyalty means holding on to everything. Sometimes loyalty means being honest about what a relationship has become, honest about what it no longer is, honest about what it costs to keep carrying it. That honesty has made my world quieter, but it has also made it warmer. My circle is smaller now than it was 30 years ago, much smaller. Yet when my phone rings, I know the voices on the other end care about me. Not what I can do, not what I can organize, not what I can provide. Me. That is a gift I once thought came from having many relationships. Now I know it comes from recognizing the right ones. And perhaps that is the truth I learned too late. The value of a relationship is not measured by how many years it survives. It is measured by how it leaves your heart feeling when the conversation ends. These days my house is quieter. The afternoons are slower. The address book sits back in that drawer. The rain still taps against the kitchen window from time to time. And when I think about all those years, I do not feel anger. I do not feel bitterness. I do not wish anyone had behaved differently. Most people were simply being who they were. The mistake was believing time alone could turn every connection into something meaningful. Now I know better. And knowing better has brought a peace I spent many years looking for in other people. a peace that was waiting for me all along.